God is good today. I want to tell you something. God is very good. And we are thankful that we can study His Word and know what His will for us is. In our last study, last week, we were looking at the Christian in the world. The Christian in the world. And today we're going to maybe look at that in some specific areas and specific thoughts. But before I do that, I want to mention just a couple points. Now, today is December the 25th, and we commonly call that what? Christmas. Now, I'm very aware that the term Christmas comes from the expression Christ Mass. Christmas is the Christ Mass. But friends, we need not be afraid of understanding and studying and appreciating the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Now, we would probably, by the prophecies, understand best that Christ was probably born in the fall, not this time of year. However, this is a time of year when many people's hearts are open to receive the gospel. Now, we can approach this from different perspectives, of course. We can just go hog all in, just like the world, and probably have no difference from the world in the way we approach it. We could just be like an iconoclast, if you please, and just try to tear down this whole idea and bring up all the pagan origins and things. And we can do that. And there may be a place to do that at times. But we could also do what Ellen White says, that we could take advantage of this time of year when people's hearts are softened and open to the gospel more than any other time. But I have a specific reason, not just because today is the 25th of December, but because of actually what we're talking about in our message, to introduce at this point also the incarnation for just a few minutes. And I'd like to begin by looking in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. And there, speaking of Jesus, he says, "Who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross." Now it says that Jesus made himself of no reputation. It's interesting that this expression, no reputation, comes from a Greek word, keno. And according to the Louw-Nida English-Greek lexicon of the New Testament, based on Semitic domains, it means to completely remove or eliminate privileges of high status or rank by eliminating all privileges or prerogatives associated with such status or rank, to empty oneself, to divest oneself of position, because the Greek literally means empty, to empty. And this is what Jesus did. Jesus came from heaven as the majesty of heaven. He who had been in the form, the morphe of God, took the form of a sinful man. And when you think about this, friends, this is amazing. We have certain creatures of this earth that we just love, you know, the cuddly little kittens, the little dogs with the wagging tails. And, you know, we like those kind of animals, right? But then what about something like a cockroach? Do you love cockroaches? Probably not. You like bats? Probably not. Opossums? Probably not. But think about this, friends. The bat, the cockroach, it's only doing what it was designed to do. It fulfills its goal that God has given it far better than we as human beings. In fact, the very worst, most filthy object in this universe is a human being. And Jesus became man for us. He left the majesty of heaven. He left the glory of heaven to become a human being. We have been told, and I think this is an amazing statement, and yes, we're looking at these fundamentals from a biblical perspective, and we'll do that in a minute. We're going to do that. We haven't even got to the fundamental yet, okay? But this is an amazing statement. When we want a deep problem to study, and by the way, friends, we should. We were taking prayer requests, and there were some prayer requests for some folks that have dementia. And we do know that there are physiological things that cause dementia, that make it worse, right? But we also know that there are things that we can do to help fight against dementia, to prevent it from coming or its rapid onset. And one thing is to work the mind. People work puzzles, and do crosswords and those kind of things. And they say it helps. But friends, when we want to really work our minds, when we want a deep problem to study, let us fix our minds on the most marvelous thing that ever took place in earth or heaven, the incarnation of the Son of God. Isn't that something? It is the most marvelous thing that has ever taken place in earth or heaven. Jesus coming to this earth as a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger. God gave His Son to die for sinful human beings, a death of ignominy and shame. He who was commander in the heavenly courts laid aside his royal robe and kingly crown, and clothing His divinity with humanity, came to this world to stand at the head of the human race as the pattern man. He humbled Himself to suffer with the race, to be afflicted in all their afflictions. The whole world was His, but so completely did He empty Himself that during His ministry He declared, "Foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay His head." That's making reference to Luke 9:58. And this is found in Letters and Manuscripts, Volume 18, 1903, paragraph 18. So I hope that you will not let this time of year go by without thinking of the most marvelous thing that ever took place in heaven or on earth. Now, I bring this up today because, in principle, it fully supports our fundamental principle that we're going to talk about today, God's standards. We might even call it God's standards and true beauty, what God defines as beauty. And so that statement, number 15 in the fundamentals, says this, that the Scriptures insist upon plainness and modesty of attire as a prominent mark of discipleship in those who profess to be the followers of Him who was meek and lowly in heart, that the wearing of gold, pearls, and costly array, or anything designed merely to adorn the person and foster the pride of the natural heart, is to be discarded according to such Scriptures as 1 Timothy 2:9 and 10 and 1 Peter 3:3 and 4. And we will look at those verses in a little bit. Now I'd like to share with you, though, at this time, a verse that I really like, a verse that means something to me. It's actually on the masthead of the Old Paths News magazine. And it says, "Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways and see and ask for what? The old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls." Sadly, they said, we will not walk therein. But this is God's invitation to us, to look for these old paths. He says there's a good way. And so our message today may appear to be, to some, an old-fashioned message. But friends, it's no more out of date today than the Scriptures. It's no more out of date today than the God of the Scriptures. It's no more out of date today than the things that God has made, like the sky and the rocks and the trees and the things that God has made. The message I'm going to share today would have been welcomed in most churches 150 years ago, and especially in Seventh-day Adventist churches. But this message probably isn't too well received today. But I want us to remember something, and this is a principle. And it's found in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 20. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 20. There Paul writes, Now then, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God did beseech you by us. We pray you in Christ's stead be ye reconciled to God. But the first part of that, now then we are what? Ambassadors for Christ. An ambassador represents a country to the government and people of another nation. And he is there to represent the interests of the people of his country within the country that he is the ambassador to. And we are to be ambassadors for Christ. We are to be children of the heavenly kingdom. And we are here in this earth. And we are to represent Christ. The question is, are we going to represent him rightly or not? Do we want to represent him rightly or not? I really hope that we have that desire in our hearts to want to represent God, no matter what it is. In 1 John chapter 5 and verse 12, 1 John chapter 5 and verse 12, it says, he that hath the Son hath what? Life. And he that hath not the Son of God hath not life. Friends, everything that we do revolves around having Jesus Christ. And if we really have Jesus Christ, friends, then we have life. And if you really love someone, do you want to please them? Do you want to try to do things to make them happy? Now, sometimes we stumble over ourselves and we make mistakes. It's true in this world. We try to do the best of things sometimes to help others, and our efforts really are not always the best. But friends, I want to tell you something. God in heaven, he perfectly understands you. He perfectly understands you. And so when you try to make an effort to please him, I want to tell you it does just that very thing. It pleases him. Because he knows what you're trying to do. And maybe your efforts are imperfect. I'm sure my efforts many times are imperfect in many ways. But God understands what we are trying to do. And in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 22, 1 John chapter 3 verse 22, here we have a principle. He says, and whatsoever we ask, we receive of him. Why? Because we keep his commandments. Let me just pause there. Are we supposed to keep the commandments of God? Yes. We just were studying in the last hour about James chapter 2, and there we read about the royal law, the law of liberty. He expects us to keep his commandments. But I want you to notice that this verse doesn't stop there. He says, and whatsoever we ask, we receive of him, because we keep his commandments and. You see that word and there, the conjunction? And do those things that are pleasing in his sight. There may be things that aren't strictly part of the commandments of God that we can do that please him. Things maybe sometimes he just hints at. Or sometimes he gives us certain information. And the point, though, that the verse makes, I think, so clear is that when we really love God, it doesn't matter what he's asking. We are glad to fulfill his will. God doesn't want us to need a ball and a chain to keep us in the straight and narrow way. He doesn't want to have to yank us around to make us obey. Do you understand what I'm saying? I think of this text in Psalms 32 and verse 8. In Psalms 32 and verse 8, he says, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. With mine eye. In other words, our relationship is so intimate that when I just look at you a certain way, you know what I'm thinking. And I think most people who are couples who have been together very long, they have this same experience. They can just sort of look at each other and they know what's on the other one's heart. And they know what the other one's wanting them to do just by looking. Just by looking. Unfortunately, some Christians, or professed Christians maybe I could say, I'm not sure, they want to walk as close to the world and hell as they can and yet still get to heaven. Did you get that? They want to walk as close to the world and to hell as they can, as if they were, on the very precipice, and would just stay a little bit to this side so that we end up in heaven. Now, we should love God enough, beloved, to do whatever He wants and to quit doing the things that He doesn't want or doesn't like. In the Bible, God compares the church and Christ to a bride and a groom. We shouldn't have to threaten one with divorce because they just don't move the car seat back to the right position. Should we? We shouldn't have to threaten someone with divorce because they don't pick up their socks properly. We should want to do those little things as a husband and wife, right? We should. We should be striving to please the other. Christ is striving to please His church. Is His church striving so hard to please Him? Now we're running in a race. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, Hebrews 12:1, he says, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses," he says, "let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us." Now here again we have this conjunction "and." He says that we should lay aside the sins. We get that, right? But he says there's also something else. He calls them weights. Weights. He doesn't define them. He says that there are weights. Well, the weights in this case, in principle, must be something that slow us down, that hinder us from running the Christian race. Anciently, when they would have these races, the runners would wear the minimum of clothing, and sometimes they would run naked in those days. When I was in high school, I ran track, and we had these very thin, very light pants, shorts, and a t-shirt, a tank top type shirt that was also extremely thin. We had these very lightweight shoes. You didn't even wear socks with them. And that's how you ran your race, because you didn't want anything to hold you back. Now, we are running a race. We are, as it were, climbing to Mount Zion. Have you ever done any mountain climbing? Have you ever done any hard hiking up hills? Well, this is a picture here, for those who can see it, of Mount Whitney. This is taken from what's called the Whitney Portal. It's like there's a camp area. It's the furthest you can drive on a road up toward Mount Whitney. And from this position to the top of Mount Whitney is still another 7,000 or 8,000 feet of elevation. You've got a little head start here on the mountain. But this is the highest peak in what we call the continental United States, Mount Whitney. And you can start up the path to Mount Whitney, and you can go a long, long way. And so one day I was going to hike there. I talked to you that morning, Tammy. You may not remember, but that morning I talked to you. I was on the way to the top of Mount Whitney. We were on the phone. I remember talking to you that morning. It was August the 14th, a few years ago. But I planned to hike to what I call high camp. There's a couple camps along the way that you can stop and rest at, outpost camp and so on. And I was going to go to the high camp and stop for the day and then make a summit attempt the next morning. Well, I had an early start, and I made such good time that I got to high camp at about 10 o'clock in the morning. I thought, what in the world am I going to do around here all day? This is crazy. But I had a backpack full of everything I needed to camp out, tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, extra jackets and coats and clothes and things. But I thought, well, why don't I just go ahead to the top of the Mount Whitney today? And so what I did, I found a little rock place that was sort of secluded, sheltered, and I took my backpack and I emptied almost everything into that little rock cove, because I didn't want to have to carry anything else extra up there than needed. Because even after you get to high camp and you hike for 2 or 3 hours, you're still only at a position about like right here. And if you can see the picture, that out there is a long way off. It's a lot further off than it is. In fact, here's a close-up view, and if you look at very carefully, you'll see there's a little thing that's a hut that's up there that's been built. And so you're still a long way off, and you need to get rid of all the weight you can. And so I was blessed to get up there, to have some nice time at the top, despite the fact it was about ready to have a thunderstorm. And we had a hailstorm on the way. I actually got held on. And then it looked like it was going to thunder. And when I'm in that little hut, I feel the hairs on my arm coming up. You know, that static electricity that says you're about ready to have a lightning strike. And so I was glad when I got down a little further and the weather cleared, and that was nice. But I came down, gathered my gear, went on down, and because I wanted to get back to the Whitney portal because there'd be a hot shower there if I got there soon enough. And there was, so I was glad for that. But the point I'm making again is that we want to eliminate all the weights that we can. Right? I mean, don't we really? Shouldn't we want to? I would hope so. Now, in Mark chapter 4, we said that we're talking about certain Christian standards today. In Mark chapter 4 and verse 24, Jesus said unto them, Take heed what ye hear. With what measure ye met, it shall be measured to you, and unto you that hear shall more be given. But what he's saying here, and especially in the first part of this verse, is we need to be careful about what we hear. In other words, there are avenues to our soul, aren't there? There's our ears, our eyes, our nose, our touch. These things are avenues to our soul by which we have senses that we perceive things, and we need to be careful. We have been told to guard the avenues of our soul, and one of the most important avenues to our soul are our ears. God gave us 2 ears. Isn't that wonderful? He gave us 2 ears so we can hear, and we can hear well, and we can, by these small differences between the 2 eardrums and those mechanisms, we can, because of this, know the direction sound is coming to us from, to a great degree. You know, you're sitting where you are and you hear me, and you know I'm in front of you. I'm not to the side, I'm not behind you. You can tell that. You close your eyes, you would still know that. It's a wonderful thing. But we need to be careful about what we hear. Now, we could talk about theological things, for sure. We need to be careful about what we hear theologically. But we need to be careful about something that Satan is a master at, and that is music. Satan is the master musician, if you please. And in the world today, we have music and music and more music. You don't see a young person today without an iPod or some kind of music device or a phone that has music on it, and they've got a Bluetooth headset or a wired set, and they're listening to music all the time. You go into the stores and music is playing all the time. I don't know if you've ever listened to any of it, but most of it, friends, doesn't meet the standards of the Bible. Most of it doesn't. I have a pair of these noise canceling headphones, and I wear them often when I go into like Walmart and stores and places, because I don't want to hear these things. I don't want to expose myself to these things. As Christians, we should know that rock and roll music, jazz, and even much of what is professed to be Christian music should not, must not be a part of our lives. Must not be a part of our lives. In Isaiah chapter 33 and verses 14 and 15 here, Isaiah 33 verses 14 and 15, he says that the sinners in Zion are afraid. Now, it doesn't say the righteous. Who's he speaking about? The sinners. The sinners in Zion are afraid. Fearfulness hath surprised the hypocrites. And then he asks a question. Who among us shall dwell with the devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings? And now in verse 15 he gives an answer. He that walketh righteously and speaketh uprightly, he that despises the gain of oppression, that shaketh his hands from holding of bribes, that stoppeth his ears from hearing of blood, and shutteth his eyes from seeing violence. He says that we shouldn't desire to see violence. We shouldn't desire to see it or to hear it even. We should not listen to violence and shut our eyes from evil. Notice the prophet is speaking here about the avenues to the soul, that which we see, that which we hear. Now, in Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 26, he says to us, "My son, give me thine heart, and let thine eyes," observe what? My ways. My ways. Now, I'm not going to try to micromanage you. I'm not going to try to tell you every detail, but there are principles here. Maybe we can watch the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Maybe we can watch the Rose Bowl Parade. I'll let you make those decisions if you think those things are Christian or not. But the point is that we as believers have to have a certain discernment, and we are to use that discernment. God doesn't just want us to be an unfiltered people. You know what I mean when I say unfiltered? In other words, we're not just to take in everything that the world has to give us and then maybe sort out the good and the bad later. We should be doing some filtering prior. In Psalms 101, verses 2 and 3, and David is writing here from an experience that was pretty difficult for him. He says, "I will behave myself wisely in a perfect way. O when wilt thou come to me? I will walk within my house with a perfect heart." Verse 3, "I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes. I hate the work of them that turn aside. It shall not cleave to me." He says, "I'll set no wicked thing before mine eyes." He had an experience of doing that, and it cost him a lot. It cost the family a lot. It cost the nation of Israel everything. But you know, we live in an age when there are some good things. After all, there's the Disney Channel, right? Disney? Isn't Disney wholesome kind of stuff? I mean, when I was growing up, you had the Walt Disney program, and they had like Davy Crockett and those kind of things, and maybe Herbie the Love Bug or whatever it was. And I don't even remember what it was about much, but those things that were supposed to be wholesome in those days. But friends, if you look back on some of those things, you'll find they're not very wholesome at all. In fact, recently I saw an advertisement for something that Disney has done, and I guess it's a movie, but I think it's called Cruella de Vil. Cruella de Vil. And I thought, wait a minute, Cruella, D-E-V-I-L. Well, that's devil. Cruel. This means cruel devil. Well, that's not very subtle, is it? But then when I did some research on it, I found out it wasn't designed to be subtle at all. It's exactly what it's supposed to mean. And it goes back even before Disney's time, per se. And Disney has adopted this, and apparently it was even in the cartoon 101 Dalmatians, which was supposed to be a nice, wholesome kids cartoon. But it wasn't at all. It wasn't at all. What I'm saying is, friends, that most of the programs on television, most of the movies you see, and yes, also most of the things on YouTube, don't meet God's standard. They don't meet God's standard. And you need to use a filter and be discerning. In Psalms 11 and verse 5, he says, "The Lord trieth the righteous, but the wicked and him that loveth violence, his soul hateth." That's an interesting text. That's an interesting text. Now, I have some family, and they're just dear precious to me. But I was asking one time, because I know this person just loves to watch all the football games. And I said, "Do you think football is a violent sport? Could football be classified as a violent?" "Oh yeah, I mean, it's violent as can be." And I said, "Well, this text here in Psalms 11, it says that we're not to love violence. If we love violence, that God can't love us like He wants to." "Oh, it doesn't mean that." It does. Well, what does it mean then? You see, here's our problem. We want to redefine the Scriptures on various levels, and instead of accepting the Scripture for what it says. Now, we've talked about some things that we see, things that we hear, even our speech. But there's something else that's left here that we need to talk about for a little bit today. And that is the things that we wear. Our apparel, the way that we present ourselves to other people. I want you to notice the text in Genesis 35. Genesis chapter 35. And starting in verse 1, God said unto Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there, and make there an altar unto God that appeared unto thee when thou fleddest from the face of Esau thy brother. Let me just pause here. Jacob had been where? Who had he been with for about 20-some years? Laban, his uncle, crooked uncle. He had fled from Esau, but now he's going to go back. God says, I want you to go back now. And notice what he says to do, verse 2. Then Jacob said unto his household, and to all that were with him, Put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments. Strange gods. When he says put away the strange gods, he wasn't speaking only of just things maybe that they were mentally thinking of. They would have these little images and idols. And if you remember the story, Rachel had some. She had stolen Laban's idols, and she hid them under herself at one point. But let's read on. Verse 3. And let us arise and go to Bethel, and I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and was with me in the way which I went. And they gave unto Jacob all their strange gods which were in their hand, and all their earrings which were in their ears. And Jacob hid them under the oak which was by Shechem. It's interesting here that they were told to put away their strange gods, but with those strange gods, they took their jewelry, their earrings off. Now, I realize we live in a society today where almost everyone wears earrings, even men today. Now, when I was in high school, and that's going back a little ways, there was no such thing as boys wearing earrings, and men wouldn't do that. I mean, the biggest football player in the school, the most masculine of guys, if he'd come in wearing an earring one day, he got laughed out of school. He would have got laughed out. But today, it's a very common thing to see men and women both wearing earrings. But in this case, when they were put away as strange gods, they associated this jewelry with it. And they put that away too. And friends, we should put away strange gods and everything that's associated with them today. Now, in ancient times, how was a harlot recognized? How was a harlot recognized in ancient times?
As with a face covering?
It was by the way that they would adorn themselves. They would use a lot of what we today call makeup. And they would have these jewels on. And this is the way people would recognize a harlot. Now it's interesting that in Revelation 17, when God is describing this spiritual harlot, notice what he says. Revelation 17, 4 and 5. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with what? Gold, and precious stones, and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. You see, anciently there was a problem. And that is that as people would move away from God, I mean, you move away from God, where do you move to? You move to yourself, and you move to Satan, of course. But as they would draw closer to God, we find the people becoming more simple and pure. But as they would move away from God, we see the opposite. For example, in Hosea chapter 2 and verse 13. Hosea chapter 2 and verse 13. And I will visit upon her the days of Balaam, wherein she burned incense to them, and she decked herself with her earrings and her jewels, and she went after other lovers and forgot me, saith the Lord. Notice the connection here. Now, we started earlier by talking about the incarnation of Jesus Christ, remember? And that he emptied himself. He who had been the majesty of heaven took the form of sinful man. He who went from the highest of all positions to the lowest of all positions. But what we see in humanity is a desire to not accept their position, but to try to exalt themselves and glorify themselves through the way that we appear. In Isaiah chapter 3, now, I'm going to read something to you, friends, and maybe you've never heard this before. But remember, God means business. verse 18 through 21. In that day the Lord will take away the bravery of their tinkling ornaments about their feet. And he's speaking here about the women of Israel. In that day the Lord will take away the bravery of their tinkling ornaments about their feet, and their calls, and their round tires like the moon, the chains and the bracelets and the mufflers, the bonnets and the ornaments of the legs, and the headbands and the tablets and the earrings, the ring and nose jewels. We know what some of those things are. We know what earrings are. We know what a nose jewel is. We know what some of these bracelets are. I'm not sure I know what round tires like the moon are, but they were some kind of an ornament that these women were wearing. But that's not all. Verse 22 through 24. The changeable suits of apparel, and the mantles, and the whipples, and the crisping pins, the glasses, and the fine linen, and the hoods, and the veils. And it shall come to pass that instead of sweet smell, there shall be stink. And instead of a girdle, a rent. And instead of well-set hair, baldness. And instead of a stomacher, a girdling of sackcloth, and burning instead of beauty. God says, I'm going to turn all this upon the ladies. Now, again, I have no problem with saying what is good for a goose is good for a gander. Men shouldn't be adorning themselves either. But I want you to read the next verse. I want you to read the next verse, verse 25. Because this gives us the result. Thy man shall fall by the sword, and thy mighty in the war. You mean what the women do can cause their men to have a downfall? Is that what this is telling us? In all honesty, is that what it's telling us? You know, today we live in a society where women want to wear anything or really sometimes nothing. And then when men look at them and whistle at them or give them attention, they think, what a perverted guy he is. How dare he do that to me? He has no right. Well, in a sense, that's true. But friends, there is a cause and effect. And it says that because of what these women have done, that their men shall fall by the sword and mighty in the war. Now, I know that we're looking at this from a biblical standpoint, but I do want to share a statement from the Spirit of Prophecy. You can just put this as a bookmark, something in between here if you need to. But I want you to listen carefully. This is from Volume 1 of the Testimonies, page 270, paragraph 1. And if this doesn't make a dear sister think, I don't know what can. Volume 1 of the Testimonies, page 270, paragraph 1. The prophecy of Isaiah 3. Now, what verses were we reading from just a minute ago? Isaiah 3. The prophecy of Isaiah 3 was presented before me as applying to these last days. And the reproofs are given to the daughters of Zion, who have thought only of appearance and display. Read verse 25. Thy men shall fall by the sword, and thy mighty in the war. I was shown that this scripture will be strictly fulfilled. I was shown that this scripture will be strictly fulfilled. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, writing to Timothy, in 1 Timothy 2, verses 8 and 9, he says, I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. In like manner also that women adorn themselves how? In modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broidered hair or gold or pearls or costly array. I understand the broidered hair means an elaborate kind of hairdo. Several years ago when I was still teaching, there was this, I don't know what to call it, hair spray craze, I don't know, where these girls were doing these hairdos that had their hair in very high and, I don't know, strange positions. But they would take, one of them told me she took a can of hairspray a day. Every day she used a new can of hairspray. She had to spray her hair so much to get it in, to hold in this.
Are you talking about when women tease their hair?
I don't know if it's teasing or what they call it, but it was sticking up high.
Yeah, that's what
And she said a can of hairspray a day, and I had several other girls tell me, yeah, just about that's how much it takes. But it says here that instead, that the lady folk should be modest in their apparel. And I think men folk should too. It doesn't mean that the men can live differently than ladies. But I want you to remember the most marvelous thing that ever took place in heaven or on earth. Jesus, who was the majesty of heaven, became sinful man for us. Did Jesus come down and wear sparkles on his face and glitter? Did he wear costly jewels? Now it's true he had a seamless robe. He had a good robe. It was a good robe. It was a good quality piece of garment. But it wasn't designed to be a flashy piece of garment. But I want you to remember what it says about him prophetically in Isaiah 53 and verse 2. There it says, "For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him." In other words, if you had looked upon Jesus as a man, you wouldn't have seen a handsome man. You wouldn't have seen someone dashing and with great flair. You would have seen a very common man. There was nothing in his outward appearance that would draw people to him. He only wanted that which was from within to draw others to him. We made reference to this text also, this next text in our fundamental itself in 1 Peter 3, verses 3 and 4. Again, speaking about our dear sisters, but I would not say that this shouldn't apply to men too, but it says, "Whose adorning, let it not be with that outward adorning of plaiting the hair and of wearing of gold or putting on apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great value." What does God view as being beautiful? I suppose if you look at the way the world treats beauty, you know, the hair has to be a certain way, the skin color a certain tone, the eyelashes and the eyebrows and all the makeup and all the things that go with it. Those are the things that make the people today, by the standards of the world, beautiful. But God says, that's not what's beautiful in my eyes. He says, what's beautiful in my eyes is that there's a meek and quiet spirit in that person. That's what God values. And not only does God, friends, but I want to tell you ladies, godly men will appreciate that too. And if they don't, they're not godly men. Godly men appreciate that. That's what they look for, if they're truly a godly man. Now, we spoke about the harlot of Revelation 17 a little bit ago. If I mention a name, one name, it is a name that will be universally scorned, universally thought of as wicked. And that name is the name Jezebel. Jezebel. And you've heard this name used in symbolism to represent women who deck themselves out with great appearance, haven't you? She's a Jezebel. Look at the way she dresses. Why would we say this? Well, if you go back to the story of the death of Jezebel, Ahab has been killed in battle. Jehu is coming. And Jehu is coming for business. And in 2 Kings 9:30, when Jehu was come to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her face and tied her head and looked out at a window. Now, I don't know if she thought she could, by her looks, entice Jehu, or maybe she was just simply knowing what was coming and she was determined to go out in style, as she would maybe think about it. But God takes this symbol of Jezebel and He uses it in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 20 in speaking to the church there at Thyatira. And He says, "Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed to idols." So this woman, she became a symbol. Her wickedness and her ways became a symbol. And God says, you know, she represents herself as a prophetess, but she certainly isn't at all. to ancient Israel in rebellion, God says, and this is in Ezekiel 23, verses 39 through 40, He says, "For when they had slain their children to their idols, then they came the same day into my sanctuary to profane it. And lo, thus have they done in the midst of mine house. And furthermore," verse 40, "that ye have sent for men to come from afar, unto whom a messenger was sent. And lo, they came. For whom didst thou wash thyself, painted thy eyes, decked thyself with ornaments?" Oh, they're trying to make themselves look good. But God says, I don't like this. I don't like this at all. In Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 30, Jeremiah 4 verse 30, "When thou art spoiled, what wilt thou do? Though thou closest thyself with crimson, though thou deckest thee with ornaments of gold, though thou rentest thy face with painting, in vain shalt thou make thyself fair. Thy lovers will despise thee. They will seek thy life." God associates the wearing of ornaments with the painting of the faces, or what we simply today call makeup. I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I just never thought kissing a girl with all that goo on her face would really be a pleasant experience. Now, maybe someone thinks differently than that. But friends, the fact is that we're not trying to become like Christ. We're trying to become like the opposite of Christ. And I think about this, and I don't know if you have begun to understand just how big of an industry cosmetics and jewelry are in this country and in the world. People are spending millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and even billions of dollars on these colorful cosmetics and jewelry in our country. And when I think about that, I think about Isaiah 55 and verse 2. Isaiah 55 verse 2. He says, "Wherefore do ye spend money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which satisfieth not? Hearken diligently unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness." How can we as Christians, knowing that there are missions that need to be supported, that there are evangelists that need to be helped, and we're spending hundreds of dollars buying a can of hairspray a day. I don't know what their hairspray cost, but probably it was a premium hairspray, knowing the people. Oh, how can we do this? God wants humble men and women who will live simply and without attention to themselves. God has us, and we are to be a valuable people. We mentioned, I think, this text a week or so ago, and the term peculiar here. But he says you are 1 Peter 2:9. 1 Peter 2:9. He says, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people." That peculiar doesn't mean that we're necessarily odd or straight-laced or narrow-minded, but I think probably by the world standards we will be considered that. But God is saying you're a valuable people to me. And he says that ye should show forth the praises of yourselves. Is that what the text says? No, that you should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. His marvelous light. He's called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. Friends, God does not wish for there to be confusion in this area. And Satan is using so many of these things to cause confusion. To cause confusion. In Deuteronomy chapter 22 and verse 5, it says there, "The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garments, for all they that do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God." And the Hebrew word that we translate abomination is tuabah. Tuabah. And tuabah means something that is detestable, something that we would loathe, an abomination. And today, many of the designers of women's clothing are homosexuals. And they have a desire to downgrade women before men. The devil wants to confuse society as to what is acceptable and what is not. Men who look like women. We have this term transgender today. We have this expression cross-dressing today. Never heard those things when I was a kid. Never heard of them. But we're seeing the effects of these kind of things today happening. Society has become confused as to what is acceptable and what is not. At one time, homosexuality was just not acceptable. But today, if you are against homosexuality, if you are against transgender, the concept of people being transgender, cross-dressing, then you are considered wrong, you're considered evil, you're considered oppressive if you disagree with those lifestyles. But God says that these things are an abomination. Think about that, men. Think about that, ladies. Again, when I grew up, I never heard of such things. But certainly it is a sign that we are in the last days. I could talk about a lot of things today, and it would be hard to maybe cover everything just like I'd like to. I think of what Paul said when he was talking to the elders of Ephesus on the island of Miletus, and he says, I've not shunned to share the whole counsel of God with you, right? I may not be able to share everything with you today, but I want to just share some things in principle. But here's another principle, 1 Corinthians 11, 14 and 15. 1 Corinthians 11, 14 and 15. He says, doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory for her hair is given her for a covering. And we've heard this stuff about women's coverings, and they have a head covering. But I think Paul is saying here that God has given the women hair for a covering. And he says, doesn't nature even teach you this? And you say, well, what does it mean nature teaches us this? Well, if I was to pull back my hair just a little bit in a couple places, you would see, and you probably can tell already, that I have somewhat what we call a receding hairline. Brother Allen's hairline has receded a lot, and he has, if I could say, not too much left on the top. We call that going bald. This is an affliction that men seem to universally have, given enough time, given enough years. Most men will have a degree of this affliction one way or the other. It is also something that women just don't have.
Well, I do.
There's an exception or two, but most women don't, at least to the degree, bald like men do, right? And so he says, doesn't nature teach you this? In other words, he's saying that, again, God wants the men to be men. He wants the women to be women. He wants people to understand who the men folk are. He wants people to understand who the women folk are. He doesn't want a confusion in this. And he says that, fundamentally, that men should have shorter hair and women should have longer hair. I'm not here to discuss how long is long and how short is short today. But there should be a difference. There should be a difference in what's happening out there. Now, while colorful cosmetics, jewelry, cross-dressing are accepted by the world today, and some of these things are accepted by other churches, including the SDA Church, and some of these things are even accepted by what we might call the OTG, or the One True God movement, we might tend to think that they could be right. But friends, the question is, what does God say about these things? I remember listening to a Joe Cruz sermon, and this was probably in the 1980s, and so I'm just trying to date this back, but he said he had, at that time, a Methodist church manual that was about 100 years old. So it would probably go back to the 1870s, 1880s, somewhere in that time. He said, at that time, he says, you couldn't even wear a wedding ring and belong to the Methodist Church. Because they had a standard. They believed these texts about not wearing gold, precious things, and apparel. And of course, the Methodist Church has changed now. You can have anything you want on. You can be a woman minister, and you can even be a homosexual minister in some of the Methodist churches now. They've lost all those standards. And in much of Adventism, we've lost these standards. We see women as ministers standing up in front of congregations wearing jewelry and makeup and heavily adorned in makeup. And I have seen some of this among those who profess to be One True God believers also. I've had certain men laugh at me and make fun of me because I wouldn't baptize someone wearing gold. And they thought it was stupid. They thought I was being too strict or whatever. But again, really the question isn't what do I think about this? The question is, What does God say about these kind of things? And what principles are we really going to live by? Are we going to live by the principles that what God says is important, and pleasing God is what is important in my life, and glorifying God and laying self, the glory of man, in what? The dust. What are we going to do? Now, it is true that some people believe that we should have standards, and our standards should be higher than the standards of the world. And let's just suppose we say that we set our standards 10 feet higher than the world. You know what that means, friends? It means we simply go into hell 10 feet later than the rest of the world, because that's where it's all going. We just get there 10 feet later. And so in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, he says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, do what? Think on these things. This is where the avenues of your soul should be. Beloved, we're talking here about things that weigh us down in our Christian experience. But I ask you again, do we love God enough to keep His commandments and do those things that are pleasing in His sight? If He's shown us things that we know are pleasing, then shouldn't we do them? And I would just close with this text in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 31. He says, whether therefore ye eat or drink or whatsoever you do all to the glory of God. Isn't that what our desire should be? To glorify God? We are a people who are supposed to give the three angels' messages. And how does it begin? The first angel's message says, fear God and give glory to Him. Not to myself. Not you to yourself, but to Him. And friends, if we will do that, God will bless us to be that peculiar people, that special people unto Himself. And I want to encourage you today to look at your life, to examine your life. Look for weights. What are the weights that could be holding me back? What are the things that maybe God is hinting at me today that, yes, I know He wants me to keep His commandments, but also and do those things that are pleasing in His sight? I tell you, friends, if we will do what God says, we will find that life becomes much happier, much better, much sweeter, because we love Him and do those things that are pleasing in His sight. And may God bless you lots and lots and lots.